welcome Annabel Schleifstein to the stage. Annabel is a third-year senior from New Orleans, and after graduation, Annabel plans to attend the University of Chicago. Yay! She's going to study chemistry. She's here today to talk to us about her distinction project. Let's give Annabel a round of applause and welcome her to the stage.
First, we have the table of contents, which just kind of shows when the next section is coming about. We're not going to do the whole thing. And we're going to start off with the background. So, what is chromatin? Chromatin is a genetic building block made up of DNA and histones. It helps to regulate gene expression and is how DNA is stored. What are histones? Histones are positively charged proteins that bind together into DNA. They regulate genes through chemical modifications. Specifically, DNA wraps around the histone octamer, which is made up of 2 copies of each of the 4 histones, H2A, H2B, H3, and H4. It is constructed with a central H3 support tetramer, meaning 2 H3 histones and 2 histones are all bonded together, and it has 2 H2A, H2B dimers bonded to that tetramer. Interactions are done through the H2A C-terminal tail and the H3 N-terminal tail. There are also 2 non-core histones that bond to the chromatin but do not make up the histone octamer. These are H1 and H5. These have very similar sequences, but H5 is able to exist as a dimer because it has residues tyrosine 53 and histidine 57, which are replaced with H1. So now, the importance of shape. Shape is a very important part of this project, as fractals are kind of shape, and protein systems all function via shape. So as you can see in that image, the active site and the substrate have the same shape, and that's why they're able to interact. If one of these changed shape slightly, they would not be able to fit together like this and would not be able to interact anymore. So now, fractals. Fractals are self-similar, infinitely repeating shapes with fractal dimensions greater than the topological dimension. This just means that you are able to zoom in on the fractal infinitely many times, and it will always look the same. The topological dimension is just an everyday geometric dimension, such as a cube would have a topological dimension of 3, and then a flat plane would have 1 of 2, and a line would have a topological dimension of 1. A fractal dimension is very similar to this, but it doesn't just exist as whole numbers, and it couldn't exist as a fraction. Before we move on to the fractal dimension, I'm going to talk about the 2 images on the slide. On the left is an image of the Mandelbrot set. This is a set of numbers shown in the blackboard that are the values of c from the equation zn squared plus c that do not diverge to infinity. That's another concept in chaos theory that we're not going to discuss today, but basically what you have to know is this is a fractal, and it would look like this if you zoomed in more. The other image is of a fern. A fern is an example of a fractal that exists in nature because if you think about the overall leaf structure, it has smaller leaves coming off of it, which exhibit the same shape as the larger leaf. These smaller leaves then themselves also have smaller leaves coming off of them, which again exhibit the same shape. This doesn't go down forever like it would in a fractal, but there is a fractal called Barnsley's fern, which exhibits this infinitely. So now for an example of fractals, which is also how Mandelbrot developed the idea of the fractal dimension, we're going to talk about measuring England's coast. So if you wanted to find the perimeter of England's coast, one way to do it would be to get 4 rulers and line them along 4 sides of England's coast like this. As you can see, this does give you an approximation of the perimeter. However, it leaves off a lot of details, both that go outside of these rulers and water that runs inside of them. If we wanted a better approximation, we could do this again by zooming in on an image of the coast and lining up more rulers. This gives you a better representation, but as you can see, the complexity of the shape just increased when we zoomed in more. To get a perfect approximation or representation of the perimeter, there is a point where we could zoom into where it wouldn't get more complex after that, but for a fractal, this would repeat infinitely. So this was how the fractal dimension was thought of. And the fractal dimension is a unitless value that shows the complexity of an object through measuring the ratio of detail change to scale change, and is calculated through the below equation, which is d being the fractal dimension, is equal to the log of n, the number of self-similar copies, over the log of s, the scale factor by which they differ. For an example of the fractal dimension, we're going to look at Sierpinski's gasket, which is the fractal shown above. It's just made up of a larger overall triangle with smaller triangles cut out from inside of each one. First, we need to get the number of self-similar copies, and since it's a fractal, there's an infinite amount, but for the sake of simplicity, we're going to pick these three larger triangles as the self-similar copies. And now we can get the length of the side, knowing how many self-similar copies there are and which triangles we're picking. So first we need the length of the overall side, and then we can get the length of one of the smaller sides. And as you can see, this has a length of 1/2 the original, making the scale factor s. So now that we know what the values of n and s are, we are able to calculate the fractal dimension. So we have d is equal to the log of 3 over the log of 2, which equals 1.53. Sierpinski's gasket is an object made up entirely of lines. This means that it has a topological dimension of 1. Since 1.53 is greater than 1, that puts the fractal dimension greater than the topological dimension and makes it into a fractal. Now we're going to move on to history. As I said earlier, Annabel was the first to discuss fractal dimension, but he was also the first to discuss fractals in his book, The Fractal Geometry of Nature, which was published in 1982. Below are some examples of fractals that he discussed, such as snowflakes, ferns, lightning strikes, and flowers. As you can see, these all exhibit self-similar shapes that, if you look smaller, they will still maintain the same shape. The first time fractals were discussed in biopolymers was in 1988 by Grosberg and collaborators. They suggested that biopolymers such as chromatin could have fractal dimensions due to crumbling when temperatures drop. And then later, in 2009, the fractal dimension of chromatin was tested by Lieberman and Aiden and collaborators. It was done with a complete genome-wide identification of chromatin-chromatin interaction called Hi-C. And then in 2017, the fractal dimension was used as a way to quantify aspects of chromatin. Almasahal and collaborators first suggested that the fractal dimension of chromatin could be a marker for cancer. If you look at the image to the right, on the left side is a benign tumor, and on the right side is a malignant tumor. The malignant tumor has a much more aggressive and complex shape, meaning it has a higher fractal dimension. This shows that higher fractal dimensions is associated with worse kinds of cancer. Something else they learned is that as the fractal dimension increases, accessible surface area increases, which is something we're going to talk about later. Now, to get on to the project, we're first going to discuss the purpose. The purpose can be broken up into 4 main parts. Number 1 is to determine the fractal dimension of unmodified chromatin. Number 2 is to determine the fractal dimension of modified chromatin. Number 3 is to see if it's changed. And number 4 is to discuss what this might be. To do this, we're going to look at models I created of the unmodified and modified histone octamer, and then look at the calculated fractal dimensions. So first, we need to discuss what modifications were done with the histone octamer. And to do that, we're going to give a brief overview of protein structure. Proteins are organic molecules made up of mostly carbons and hydrogens, but they also include amino acids, such as lysine, which is the main amino acid looked at in this project, that help build these proteins. These are also made up of mostly carbons and hydrogens, but they have different things on their tails. The specific modifications we're looking at are post-translational modifications. These are modifications done after DNA has already been translated into a protein. The specific modifications looked at in this project are acetylation and methylation, but these are not the only modifications that can be done. Some other examples are phosphorylation, which is the addition of phosphates, the hydroxyl group of serine, thymine, and tyrosine residues. This reduces the positive charge and helps with transcription and DNA repair. There's also simulation and ubiquitization. These regulate the degradation, localization, activity, and interactions of proteins, and they work by attaching small ubiquitin-like molecules, which have 100 or fewer amino acids, or ubiquitins, which have 76 amino acids, to lysine residues. So starting off with lysine acetylation, this is a modification that occurs on all 4 histones at various lysine residues. It works by neutralizing the positive charge of the histone octamer, which then releases DNA to DNA binding proteins and decreases the tension of folding. If you look at the image above, you can see on the left a histone which is unmodified having the lysine, or A lysine residue, which is unmodified, has a amino tail, which is, as you can see, a positively charged residue. You can then see that an arrow goes and shows the other histone, which is highlighted in red, using histone acetyltransferase, which adds an acetyl group and neutralizes the positive charge. It can be undone using histone deacetyltransferase. Next, we have lysine methylation. It works similarly to lysine acetylation, being that the amino group is replaced with methyl groups, but it can happen as monomethylated, dimethylated, or trimethylated lysine, meaning it's attached 1, 2, or 3 times. This interferes with interactions between chromatin binding factors and DNA, and it can also help reader proteins switch genes on and off. In the image, you can see on the far left, unmodified lysine residue, highlighted in blue. And then you can see it being added by histone methyltransferase 1, 2, or 3 times. And it can be undone using histone demethyltransferase. Now we're going to go into methods. All of the protein modeling in this project was done using JMOL User Design Environment. This is a free online software that allows you to take protein models and change the color or structural shape of the protein models. All of the protein models looked at were taken from Protein Data Bank, and the specific model of the histone optimer that was chosen was created in 1999 by Caroline Luger and was taken through X-ray diffraction at a resolution of 3.1 angstrom. This model has one caveat, which is that the C and N terminal tails are not fully shown, which is fine for the specific project, but just note that any modifications done were not through the ends of the tails. How the proteins were modified is done using CharmGUI's Protein Data Bank reader manipulator function. This function allows you to select target residues and select which modification you'd like to happen to them. The original histone optimer was put into this program, and then the desired residues were selected and modified. To calculate the fractal dimension, ultrascan solutions modeler dimension function was used. This was chosen because the surface of chromatin was responsible for bonding to DNA, so I thought it would be most important to look at as opposed to looking at the whole shape of the molecule. This method specifically works by breaking molecules into spheres to better understand the shape. You can see those images represented on the right with the surface of a molecule or the whole molecule broken up into spheres. This method also specifically uses the box counting algorithm to determine fractal dimension. This is an algorithm that works by breaking a 3D object into smaller boxes, which are basically 3D pixels, with a size of epsilon and counting the number of boxes containing the pattern at each scale. This algorithm basically just allows you to take the regular fractal dimension equation and use it for 3D shapes. Now on to the results. As we go through the results, we're going to look at each individual model and discuss its calculated fractal dimension. The individual core histones have no calculated fractal dimension because it would be redundant as they only operate in the histone optimer. We're going to start off with the nucleosome, which doesn't have a calculated fractal dimension, but it's just the histone optimer with DNA wrapped around it. The DNA is shown in orange with red tails. The core histones inside of it are H2A, shown in teal, H2B, shown in yellow and orange, H3 in purple, and H4 in pink. Now, the unmodified histone optimer, which is just the same model, but without the DNA, has a fractal dimension calculated of 2.154 plus or minus 0.026. Remember, since this is the surface of the molecule and not the whole molecule, it has a topological dimension of 2. This means that it has a fractal dimension greater than the topological dimension and qualifies as well. H2A is the next core histone that we're going to look at, which you can see above. This is the only histone with a fully realized C-terminal tail with this color residue. Again, this is not fully depicted in this model, but part of it is visual. The C-terminal tail is responsible for structure and helps with DNA attachment. The DNA also attaches throughout the docking domain, colored in green and red above the blue tail. Other domains that are shown are the acidic patch in light blue, which is where the negatively charged portion where non-histone proteins can bind. The hydrophobic patch is colored in gray and is where various proteins modeling factors bind. The outer loop is the turquoise part at the top where the two H2A molecules connect. This is because it's responsible for connection of the dimers, the H2A H2 dimers. And then the L2 loop, which is where the dimers connect to the tetramer, is colored in light green. Now H2B, this has a very similar sequence to H2A, so I'm not going to go over all of the different domains again. But basically it has the acidic patch colored in red, the L1 loop colored in pink, which you can see is where they connect, and the L2 loop in yellow. And then for H3, this, as it's part of more before, doesn't have as many domains shown as it didn't matter as much for this structure of the surface. This had the L1 loop at the top colored in light purple, which joins the paths of the tetramer, and the L2 loop in the bottom colored in dark purple. This helps to form the tetramer and give it more structure. And then H4, again, just has the L1 loop and the L2 loop colored. L1 is in purple and it's at the bottom, and this helps with structural stability. And the L2 loop is colored in orange or salmon, and it helps to stabilize the stone. Now H1, which is one of the non-core stones that helps bind to DNA to help modify it, is shown above. This specifically has the residues that contact DNA shown in red. It had a fractal dimension calculated at 2.001 plus or minus 0.2. This means that its fractal dimension, which changes it from 2, was over that, like within the error, meaning that it doesn't really count as a fractal. So we're not going to discuss it that much since that's not the focus of this project. And then H5, which is the monomer version of H1 essentially, has more residues shown, or more domains shown, with the DNA docking site 1 in yellow, DNA docking site 2 in gold, the residues involved in individualism binding in purple, and the residues that form the dimer colored in orange. This had a fractal dimension calculated as 2.031 plus or minus 0.016. That makes it a lot bigger than H1. And remember, since this is the surface fractal dimension, it's not larger due to being two halves of the same molecule. It's larger because of changes in how the structure is shaped due to having exchanged residues and being able to find some dimer. And now we're going to talk about the modified histone octamer. All of these images will be orange with the important residues colored in light green. The unmodified version of the histone octamer will be shown on the left for reference, again with the important residue colored in light green, so that you can compare what the change in shape is. First off, we have the structure with glycine 79 methylated. As you can see, the version on the left has just a little bit colored in green, and the version on the right has more green dots shown. This is because the specific, like the modification add molecules or add atoms to the molecule, which is partially why the structure and the fractal dimension changed. This had a fractal dimension of 2.168 plus or minus 0.027, which is greater than the unmodified histone octamer. Next, we have the structure with lysine 56 acetylated. Again, as you can see, this had more green dots in the version on the right, meaning it had more atoms added. Again, this is a different modification than the previous one, but it did end up having the same fractal dimension of 2.168 plus or minus 0.027. And then we have the structure with lysine 91 acetylated. This had a fractal dimension of 2.164 plus or minus 0.026, which is smaller than the previous two, but it is the same modification as the last one. So that kind of shows how just doing the modification to any residue doesn't change the fractal dimension in the same way every time. And then finally, we have the structure with lysines 108 and 116 acetylated. This was calculated to have a fractal dimension of 2.162 plus or minus 0.029. This was also the only structure looked at that had two different residues modified, and it was the modified version of the histone octamer with the smallest fractal dimension. So keep that in mind, because we'll talk about it more later. And now on to discussion. So the initial fractal dimension of unmodified chromatin was 2.154 plus or minus 0.026. For every modification looked at, it only changed the fractal dimension by about 0.01. This is a very small increase, but it shows that the accessible surface area is increasing as we previously discussed. That's because both of the modifications looked at either release DNA to make it less, like fully less tightly, or allow other proteins to attach. So why is this increase in accessible surface area important? The accessible surface area is the area of DNA for other enzymes to bond to. An increase in accessible surface area means that there's more space for enzymes to bond and that more gene regulation can happen. This is important as chromatin is not static and does change, so the fact that more gene changes could be happening is important to know what the marker of that is. The results of this increased fractal dimension, what we already said, the modified versions only change the fractal dimension slightly, and we're very close to each other, all being about 2.16. This makes sense as we only looked at 1 or 2 modifications to a residue at a time, and modifications in real life don't happen as 1 or 2, they tend to happen with more amounts at the same time. This means that in reality, your fractal dimension would have changed by more and would have been more noticeable. What can be learned from looking at the fractal dimension? The fractal dimension can help understand the surface of chromatin as a quantifiable number, and it shows the compaction of chromatin and the ability of other molecules to bind. It could also show whether modifications have happened to chromatin, since as we saw, the fractal dimension increased when it was modified. So is it important to look at the fractal dimension when we have other forms of observation? The fractal dimension only needs the shape of the molecule and not more individual parts of the structure or things like charges to be studied. So it allows for fewer things to need to be looked at. It also allows proteins to be compared with a quantifiable number, and this number is easily communicated because it doesn't even have a unit, so you don't even have to make sure it's converted the same. And it's also always good to have more ways to study the same thing and more ways to discuss how something might change. So now future applications. As I've already discussed, the fractal dimension could be used as a marker for cancer. It could also potentially be used as a marker for other diseases. For various autoimmune diseases, an early marker is the overmethylation of histone oximer. Since, as we talked about, the methylation could be shown through an increase in the fractal dimension, perhaps that fractal dimension could be used as an early marker for this as well one day. So future research. In this project, I looked at the fractal dimension of chromatin with a few modifications. So it would be good to look at how different modifications affect the fractal dimension. It would also be good to look at what happens when multiple modifications happen at once, especially those that cause different good or bad consequences in the body. This would mean that you could then use the fractal dimension to qualify whether something good or bad is happening. It would also be good to apply the fractal dimension as a measure for other proteins. Chromatin is a very important protein, but it's not the only important protein in the body, so it would be good to see how this affects other things. So now, conclusion. We talked about how the fractal dimension is a unitless value that can be used to quantify the surface of something such as chromatin, and how an increase in the fractal dimension can show whether modifications have happened to chromatin, and can show an increase in the accessible surface area. It could also be used as a marker for diseases such as cancer and possibly others in the future. So, acknowledgements. This was a really big project, and there are some people I would really like to thank. One of them being my mentor, Dr. Allison Landry. She was one of the inspirations for this project as we did protein modeling in her mole cell class, and I really enjoyed it. So I knew I wanted to do a project involving that. And she also helped me find models for my proteins and to make sure I made them well, and helped me with everything, and I really appreciate it. I would also like to thank my readers, Dr. Robert Dawn and Mr. David Anderson. They helped me understand the physics of this and the math side of this, and their classes helped me want to look into fractals with chemistry. I also want to thank my family. I'm really happy that they decided to come up today, and they've always been some of my biggest supporters. I also really want to thank my friends, especially Monica. She really helped me. But everyone helped me to make sure I worked hard, but also to work at the end of the day. So, any questions?
got me excited. I was in the back and I stood up and I was like, yes, the Jets is coming out of me. I'm gonna ask you a fun question. We're talking about all these proteins.
Yes.
Which do you think is most important? DNA or protein? Which one's more important? Y'all should have more questions about genetics and online principles of genetics fine. Number one, what is more important, DNA or protein? Shoot.
Well, I mean, protein can change DNA, so I feel like that's pretty important, even though DNA stores all the genetic material. Oh, is that
No. This is a fun question. No, seriously, what role do you think these fractals should have in epigenetics?
So I took chaos theory last year, and I really liked it, and I really liked learning about fractals especially. And so I took it in the fall last year, so then I kind of went into all my classes for the rest of the year thinking about fractals, and then I took wholesale, and I was like, wait, these two things can go really well together, because I remember Dr. Blanchard was talking about how important shape was in biology, and I was thinking about fractals and how those are shapes. And so I really wanted to look into how fractals would affect biology and stuff like that. And then we looked at, like, I was thinking about all the different, like, proteins or things I could study and learn about proteins.
And a big thing that you, the space, what you're showing is you're showing that there's space available for modification. And I believe with, looking at the epigenome and the time, I think this has huge implications in the realm of epigenetics. For those who are interested in epigenetics, it's so cool because things can be modified at different times even than we previously realized.
So you were talking about tumors and how when they're benign they have little to no fractals, but when they're malignant they form. Do the fractals make it harder to remove these tumors?
I don't think they make it harder to remove them. I think it's not the fractal as itself. I think the fractal is more of like a way to quantify it. If that makes sense. I mean, like,
do you see yourself like continuing in this field like for an actual job after college?
like fractals?
Yeah, just like in this general area.
Like biology?
We'll just go with fractals. Sure.
Fractals? I mean, I would like, there's more I would like to research about if I had like more like ability to do a bigger project. Like I'd like to look at other proteins and different modifications, like I said at the end. So yeah. Anna.
So you said that there were different modifications on the different proteins. Why were the modifications you used different?
Like what do you mean specifically?
Did you say that because you chose like 4 different examples, and then you said that there were like the methods, the modifications used on one were like the same or different than the
So like this would be like something that's methylated, which means that a methyl is being attached to the end of the residue, and that's different from the rest of them, which are all acylated residues, meaning an acyl group attached. So it's just like a different molecules being attached, and it does different things.
The numbers represent different
Oh, yeah.
lysine residues. So that's lysine 108, so that means there's a lysine at position 108 and a lysine at position 116. Every one of the lysines that were looked at in the study were at different locations on that histone protein.
It's okay, you know.
What's the upper limit for the values you get from the fractal definition?
Upper limit?
Because from your presentation, you got values as like 2.62, but could it be like a 3 point something?
So these are lower because they're closer to being like two-dimensional. But if you were looking at like the whole structure, it would have a number that starts with 3, most likely if it is a fractal, because it's 3-dimensional and 2-dimensional. So it starts with like a 2 because it's a 2-dimensional shape. And then the reason that the other numbers are so low is just because it's showing that it's closer to being 2-dimensional than 3-dimensional. But it's like in between 2 and 3-dimensional. Does that make sense?
So there's no like upper limit to what the fractal dimension could give you?
If I'm understanding what you're asking right, then yeah, I don't think there's nothing on it.
So, knowing the process that's happening, is there a way to reverse it? If it is connected to tumors or if it is connected to autoimmune, is there a theoretical way to reverse it so the surface area is lessened?
Well, so like the modifications, you can undo them. Like there are enzymes to do them and then enzymes to undo them. So if you undo it and like the modification is increasing the fractal dimension, undoing it would decrease it. Yes.
Is there any way that this correlates with like this? Its ability, like the ability that it could undergo modification? It's susceptibility.
Susceptibility?
Yeah.
Can you rephrase
This
that?
molecule is like really, this one here definitely is undergo deformation.
I don't think that the fractal dimension shows whether like a specific residue would be modified more likely, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah.
Okay. It just shows whether or not it's happened.
If you decrease the fractal dimension of something, would it make it less likely to become cancerous?
So I don't think the fractal, like having a fractal dimension is what causes it to be cancerous. I think it's being used as like a diagnostic criteria, so like to quantify the surface of it, if that makes sense. Like it's qualifying how complex the surface of it is. Alex.
So you mentioned earlier that the more fractal is the larger the surface area is, correct? So how does this maybe impact fields like the medical field, like maybe more efficient source of medications through, fractally engineered, if that makes sense? Capsules, or maybe things like more efficient heat dispersion, computers, things like that.
So I think like fractals have been used for things like the engineering field. I don't know if they've been specifically used in the medical field, but I'm sure there's something that you could use it for. I just don't really know right now, but that would be something really interesting to look into, I think.
Do you have a favorite fractal in nature?
I am a big fan of birds, that's why I put them in here.
All right, y'all, I hope y'all appreciate the interdisciplinary nature of this distinction project. When Annabel came to be talking about doing distinction, we started talking about protein modeling and what can be done from a protein standpoint. And you guys asking me about repeating structures, and I brought up chromatin. And I want to say that for the rest of that, Annabel took that and ran with it. This is probably the most hands-off distinction I have ever had in